Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into, well, a truly unique kind of conflict, one that shaped the world for almost half a century, cast this really long, chilling shadow over global history.
It really did, and what makes it so fascinating, so different, is that its main players, these two global superpowers, they never actually declared all-out war on each other. No direct fighting between them.
Exactly. It's like this enormous high-stakes global chess match, right?
Yeah.
Played not just with armies, but with ideas, economic muscle, propaganda, trying to win people over. And all of it, under this terrifying constant threat of, well, total nuclear annihilation.
It's an incredible paradox, isn't it? This period of intense, relentless rivalry, yet defined by the lack of that direct, full-scale clash between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which is precisely why it got that name.
That specific, chilling name. So yes, today our deep dive is into the Cold War, and our mission for you listening is to really unpack what this era was all about.
Yeah.
What were its roots? How did it actually work? How did nuclear weapons just completely change the game?
Right. And we'll zoom in on those moments where things got really hairy, like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Ugh.
Talk about edge-of-your-seat history.
Absolutely. And then how did it all end? It seemed like it would go on forever, but it didn't. So what were the complex factors, the pressures, that finally brought this massive global standoff to a close?
So think of this as your essential guide. We've gone through a lot of material historical accounts, analyses, articles, trying to pull out the key insights, the things you really need to grasp to understand this pivotal period. We're aiming to give you that solid foundation.
That's the plan. So let's set the scene a bit more. Our sources describe this time as an open yet restricted rivalry. That phrase really jumps out. It was between the United States and the Soviet Union, obviously, and their allies.
And waged on so many fronts.
Yeah.
Political maneuvering, economic competition, that constant propaganda war we mentioned. And this is the crucial bit with, as the sources say, only limited recourse to weapons, at least directly between the big two.
Which makes it truly cold. And we're about to explore just how profound that coldness was, and maybe more importantly, why it stayed that way for so long. Okay, so let's start right there. That core definition, open yet restricted rivalry. Can we break that down a bit? What does open yet restricted actually mean in practice? It still sounds a bit contradictory.
It absolutely is a contradiction, but it captures the essence perfectly. Open, because, look, the disagreements weren't secret. Everyone knew the U.S. and its allies stood for capitalism, democracy, individual liberties, while the Soviet Union and its bloc promoted communism, state control, collective ideology.
Right, the battle lines were clearly drawn, ideologically speaking.
Exactly. They openly competed for influence, trying to get other countries to adopt their system, join their alliances. There was no hiding the rivalry. It was played out on a world stage.
But the restricted part, that's the key to the cold aspect, isn't it? That implies some kind of limit, some lines that weren't crossed, even in the heat of the moment.
Precisely. The major restriction was on direct, large-scale military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union themselves, and their main military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact later on. They actively, consciously avoided shooting at each other.
So instead of tanks rolling across borders between them, the fight happened elsewhere, or in different ways.
Yes. The main fronts, as we said, were political diplomacy, alliance building, undermining the other side's influence, economic, trying to prove which system worked better, using aid or trade as leverage, and propaganda, that relentless battle for hearts and minds, painting the other side as dangerous or doomed. Weapons were involved, massively so, but mostly indirectly or as a deterrent.
Let's dig into those fronts a bit. The political one, what did that look like day to day? Was it all UN debates and spying?
Well, yes, UN debates were definitely a stage for the rivalry, lots of vetoes in the Security Council, for instance. But it was much broader. It involved forming alliances, like NATO for the West. The Soviets countered later with the Warsaw Pact. It meant pouring resources into supporting friendly governments or movements, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly.
Like propping up dictators if they were anti-communist or funding rebel groups?
Both sides did versions of that, absolutely. Trying to sway newly independent nations in Africa and Asia was a huge political battleground. Espionage, of course, was rampant. The CIA versus the KGB is legendary for a reason. Trying to get intelligence, trying to destabilize the other side, influencing elections. It was a constant shadow war.
Okay, and the economic front. You mentioned aid, like the Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
How else was economics a weapon?
It was fundamentally a contest between two economic models, capitalism versus centrally planned communism. The U.S. used things like the Marshall Plan massive aid to rebuild Western Europe after the war, partly to foster stable democracies resistant to communism, but also to create markets for U.S. goods and integrate Europe into a U.S.-led global economy.
So creating prosperity as a shield against communism.
That was a key idea. The Soviets, meanwhile, tried to build their own economic bloc, Comecon, integrating Eastern European economies with their own, often through state-controlled trade and socialization. It was about demonstrating which system could deliver a better life, technologically advance faster, achieve greater production. It was a competition for legitimacy through material success.
And propaganda. That
Yeah.
sounds like it was everywhere.
Oh, it was pervasive. Both sides ran huge campaigns, domestically and internationally. You had state media like Pravda or TASS in the Soviet Union, and powerful international broadcasters like the Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, funded by the U.S., beaming messages across the Iron Curtain.
Trying to convince people on the other side that their system was flawed.
Exactly. And also reinforcing belief in their own system at home. It wasn't just news. It involved cultural exchanges designed to showcase the benefits of one system over the other. Promoting certain artists or intellectuals, even sports, became a huge arena for ideological competition. Think of the Olympics. The space race was another massive propaganda battleground, symbolizing technological superiority.
Right. The race to the moon wasn't just about science.
Not at all. It was deeply symbolic of which system was more dynamic, more capable. Every success was trumpeted as proof of ideological virtue. It was a constant psychological pressure campaign.
It's fascinating how central those non-military aspects were. Now, the term itself, Cold War,
Yeah.
where did that phrase actually come from? It's so evocative.
It is, and its origins are quite telling. Our sources point to the English writer George Orwell as the first to use it in this context. He wrote an essay, You and the Atom Bomb, back in October 1945.
Wow, 1945. So right as World War II was ending, before things really solidified?
Exactly. Incredible foresight. Orwell predicted this nuclear stalemate between what he called 2 or 3 monstrous superstates. He saw that nuclear weapons, capable of wiping out millions instantly, would likely prevent large-scale wars between these powers.
But not lead to real peace either.
That was his chilling prediction. He said it wouldn't be peace, but a state of permanent Cold War. He basically foresaw the era of mutually assured destruction, the idea that nuclear weapons made total war unthinkable but created this constant, tense, non-shooting conflict, a peace that is no peace.
Orwell, just uncanny sometimes. How did it jump from his essay into mainstream political language, especially in the U.S.?
It really entered the American public consciousness through Bernard Baruch. He was a very influential financier and advisor to presidents. In a speech in South Carolina in April 1947, he declared quite starkly, "Let us not be deceived. We are today in the midst of a Cold War."
So Baruch really popularized it, made it official in a sense.
Yes, hearing it from a prominent figure like him really cemented the term. It signaled that the U.S. leadership was acknowledging this new reality, this ongoing struggle that wasn't a traditional war, but required a sustained, different kind of response to the Soviets.
Okay, so if it wasn't a hot war, what was the defining characteristic that made it so different from, say, World War I or World War II?
The absolute core, the defining feature, was the absence of direct military confrontation between the main players, the U.S.-led West and the Soviet-led East. That's the bedrock understanding. No large-scale battles between American and Soviet soldiers.
That lack of direct fighting is what makes it cold.
Precisely. The world lived under this constant tension, this nuclear shadow, but the superpowers themselves never crossed that line into direct warfare against each other. It was a deliberate avoidance, born out of fear and a degree of calculation.
And a huge part of why they avoided it was this clash of fundamental beliefs, wasn't it? It wasn't just about land or resources in the old way. It was deeply ideological.
Absolutely central. At its heart, the Cold War was a profound war of ideologies. It was capitalism versus communism. The U.S. championed individual liberty, free markets, democracy, though, practice didn't always match the ideal. The Soviet Union promoted collective ownership, a classless society led by the Communist Party again, with a huge gap between theory and reality.
Two completely different visions for how society should be organized.
Diametrically opposed visions for the future of humanity, really. And this ideological battle wasn't just abstract. It fueled the propaganda, the spying, the support for allies and proxies we talked about. Each side tried constantly to prove its system was morally superior, more efficient, the inevitable way forward for the world. The competition in science, culture, economics, it was all framed within this ideological contest.
So it was philosophical, but was it also just a raw power struggle? Like beyond the big ideas, was it just about controlling territory and resources?
Oh, definitely. Ideology provided the justification, the narrative, the rallying cry. But underneath, it was absolutely an intense bare-knuckle competition for global influence and power. Both superpowers wanted to expand their reach, secure access to resources, oil, minerals, strategic locations, and deny those advantages to the other side.
So spheres of influence, military bases, controlling trade routes.
All of that. Vying for alliances with those newly independent nations was key. Trying to shape international organizations like the UN, it was about molding the global order to favor their own interests, their own security, their own economic system. So yes, deeply ideological, but also fundamentally geopolitical power politics.
Okay, this cold aspect, the lack of direct superpower fighting, is critical. And you mentioned the reason, the giant elephant in the room, nuclear weapons. How exactly did these civilization-ending weapons define the conflict and keep it, paradoxically, cold?
This is probably the single most important factor to grasp. The existence, the sheer presence of nuclear weapons was absolutely central. Both the US and the Soviets eventually built up these massive arsenals, thousands upon thousands of warheads, weapons of unimaginable destructive power.
More than enough to destroy each other many times over.
Many times over. And this fundamentally changed the logic of war. It wasn't about winning anymore in the traditional sense, because winning could mean destroying yourself in the process.
So it became about not fighting, about deterring the other side.
Exactly. It led directly to the concept of deterrence, and specifically mutually assured destruction, or MAY, such a fitting acronym. The core idea was fear, the certainty that if one side launched a nuclear first strike, the other side would still have enough weapons left to launch a devastating retaliatory strike.
Annihilation for both sides.
Mutual annihilation. This terrifying logic, this shared fear, is what prevented either side from seriously contemplating a full-scale war against the other. It created this incredibly tense but perversely relatively stable standoff. The potential cost of war was just too high. It was unthinkable.
So the deadliest weapons ever made actually enforced a kind of peace, albeit a terrifying one.
That's the paradox. A tense, fragile, nerve-wracking peace between the main antagonists, maintained by the threat of ultimate catastrophe. It was a constant tightrope walk over the abyss.
All right, so we understand how it stayed cold, largely due to Medvedev.
Okay.
But let's rewind. How did it even start? The U.S. and the Soviet Union were allies in World War II, fighting Hitler together. What happened after VE Day in May 1945? How did that alliance disintegrate so fast?
It's a crucial question. The scene is Europe, spring 1945. Nazi Germany surrenders. But even as they celebrated victory, that wartime alliance between the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union, which was always, let's be honest, a bit uneasy, started to unravel almost immediately.
Uneasy. So there were tensions even during the war.
Oh, yes. Deep suspicions. Fundamentally different long-term goals. Think about the Yalta Conference early in 45. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, they agreed on defeating Germany, but they had major disagreements about what post-war Europe should look like, especially Poland's future government and borders and how Germany itself would be handled.
So the common enemy papered over cracks that were already there.
Exactly. Once Hitler was gone, those cracks became gaping chasms, and the biggest immediate fault line was Eastern Europe.
Right, the areas the Soviet Red Army had liberated from the Nazis. What was happening there?
As the Red Army advanced, Soviet influence followed. By 1948, the Soviets had effectively installed left-wing governments, which quickly became communist-dominated regimes across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, country after country fell under Moscow's control.
Which the West saw as a betrayal of wartime agreements about free elections.
Absolutely. They saw it as Stalin breaking his promises, creating a Soviet sphere of influence by force, not allowing self-determination. This installation of compliant regimes was a huge point of friction.
So why did the Soviets do it? What were their motivations? Was it just naked expansionism, spreading communism, or something else?
Our sources suggest two main drivers, closely linked. First, and perhaps foremost for Moscow, was security. You have to remember, Russia, then the Soviet Union, had been invaded from the West twice in 30 years, World War I and World War II. The second time, the cost was unimaginable, maybe 27 million Soviet lives lost.
A staggering, almost incomprehensible loss.
It left a deep scar, a paranoia about future invasion. So they were absolutely determined to maintain control of Eastern Europe as a buffer zone, a protective shield against any...
So they saw it as helping history along, liberating the working class.
In their view, yes. They believed their system was superior and morally just, and that extending it was both ideologically correct and strategically necessary. So security and ideology became tightly intertwined justifications for their actions in Eastern Europe.
And how did the U.S. and Britain react to this consolidation of Soviet power? What were their specific fears?
They were deeply alarmed. They feared permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, seeing it not as a defensive buffer, but as the creation of a Soviet empire threatening the rest of the continent. They genuinely feared the loss of freedom for millions in those countries.
And the fear wasn't just about Eastern Europe, was it? It extended westward.
Yes, there was a very real concern about the threat of Soviet-influenced communist parties coming to power in the democracies of Western Europe. Countries like France and Italy had large popular communist parties, especially right after the war when economies were shattered and people were desperate for change.
So the worry was a domino effect that Western Europe could fall to communism too.
That was the fear. That economic chaos and political instability would make communism seem appealing, and Soviet influence would spread across the entire continent. This was seen as an existential threat to Western democracy, capitalism, and American influence.
So you have these clashing fears, clashing goals, clashing ideologies. How did this hardening of positions as mutual suspicion lead to the actual division of Europe, the formation of the two blocs?
It solidified really quickly, mainly between 1947 and 1948. Two key developments really locked the division in place. On the Western side, the Marshall Plan.
We mentioned that earlier, the big U.S. aid package.
Right. Officially, the European Recovery Program, launched in 1948, it poured billions of dollars into rebuilding Western European economies. While presented as humanitarian aid, and it did genuinely help rebuild, it was also deeply strategic. Our sources say it effectively brought those countries under American influence.
By tying them economically and politically to the U.S.
Exactly. By fostering economic recovery, it aimed to stabilize democratic governments, reduce the appeal of communism, and integrate these countries into a U.S.-led capitalist system. It was incredibly successful in rebuilding Western Europe and anchoring it firmly in the Western camp.
So the U.S. is using economic aid to build its bloc. What's the Soviet response in Eastern Europe? Did they get offered Marshall Plan aid?
They were offered it initially, but Stalin saw it as American interference, an attempt to undermine Soviet influence. He forbade the Eastern European countries under his control from accepting the aid. Instead, the Soviets focused on cementing their own control, installing openly communist regimes modeled on the Soviet system, one-party states, centrally planned economies, secret police, the whole apparatus.
So a direct contrast to the Marshall Plan's approach.
A stark contrast. And the Soviets created their own economic bloc, Comecon, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, in 1949, to bind the Eastern European economies to Moscow and counter the Marshall Plan's influence.
And this whole process, the Marshall Plan in the West, the communist consolidation in the East, this is the Iron Curtain falling, isn't it?
It is exactly that. Winston Churchill coined the phrase Iron Curtain in a famous speech in 1946, but these events in 47-48 are what really brought it down, hard. You had Western Europe recovering under American influence and Eastern Europe locked behind Soviet control. The division was economic, political, ideological, and increasingly physically fortified. The stage was set for decades of confrontation across this divide. The wartime alliance was well and truly dead.
Okay, so the lines are drawn, the Iron Curtain is down, Europe is divided. How does this rivalry actually play out now? Does it just simmer, or do things escalate quickly?
Well, it wasn't static. The Cold War had phases. The early years, say 1948 to 1953, were incredibly tense. Our sources call this the first real peak of the Cold War, a time of rapid escalation, formalizing the blocs, and some very dangerous moments.
What were some of those early flashpoints that really defined this initial intense period?
One of the very first major confrontations, right after the division solidified, was the Berlin blockade. June 48 to May 49.
Right, West Berlin was like an island of democracy deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, and the Soviets tried to squeeze it out.
Exactly. They cut off all road, rail, and canal access to the western sectors of Berlin, hoping to force the Western allies, the U.S., Britain, France, to abandon the city. It was a direct challenge.
But the West responded, didn't they, with the airlift?
They did. The Berlin airlift was an incredible feat. For almost a year, American and British planes flew round-the-clock missions, landing every few minutes at Berlin's airports, delivering food, coal, medicine, everything needed to keep West Berlin alive. Over 2 million tons of supplies.
Well, And the Soviets eventually backed down.
He did. The blockade failed. It was a huge propaganda victory for the West and showed their determination to stand firm. But it also highlighted the potential for miscalculation and conflict right at the heart of Europe.
And it was around this time that the main Western military alliance was formed.
Yes, directly spurred by fears heightened by the Berlin blockade and the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in '48. In April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established.
Its core principle being collective defense.
That's the heart of it. Article 5. An attack on one member is an attack on all. It created this unified military command, initially under Eisenhower, to resist the Soviet presence in Europe. Key members were the US, Canada, UK, France, Italy, and others. It formalized the military division of Europe and sent a clear message of deterrence to Moscow.
So alliances hardening, tensions rising over Berlin, and then later in 1949, something happens that completely changes the strategic calculus, doesn't it? Something nuclear.
Monumental. In August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. WWII, the Americans called it. This event, our sources stress, ended the American monopoly on the atomic bomb.
Which the U.S. had held since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in '45.
Right. For 4 years, the U.S. was the sole nuclear power. Suddenly, that advantage was gone. The nuclear arms race was well and truly on. The fear of mutual destruction, that Orwellian Cold War, became much more real, much more immediate. The stakes were raised exponentially.
And 1949 was a huge year for another reason too, wasn't it? Expanding the Cold War beyond Europe in a massive way.
Indeed. In October 1949, Mao Zedong's communists won the civil war in China, establishing the People's Republic of China. Suddenly, the world's most populous nation was communist.
So the Cold War wasn't just a U.S.-Soviet-Europe-focused thing anymore.
Not at all. This was huge. It vastly expanded the perceived communist threat, created a major new communist power center, and meant the Cold War was now undeniably a global conflict, with a massive front in Asia. In the U.S., it led to bitter recriminations about the loss of China and fueled the Red Scare.
Wow. Blockade, NATO, Soviet bomb China, all within about a year or so. And this intense period culminates in an actual shooting war, the first major hot war of the Cold War era.
Yes, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. It started when communist North Korea, backed by the Soviets and later heavily supported by China, invaded South Korea, which was backed by the U.S. and the UN.
So not direct U.S.-Soviet fighting, but fighting through proxies.
Exactly. The U.S. led the UN forces fighting North Koreans and, later, huge numbers of Chinese volunteers. The Soviets provided weapons, training, air support, but carefully avoided direct clashes with U.S. forces. It was a brutal war, costing millions of lives, mostly Korean.
And the outcome? Did either side win?
Our sources call it indecisive. After 3 years of intense fighting, the war ended with an armistice in 1953, establishing a ceasefire line roughly along the original border, the 38th parallel. It created the divided Korea we still see today.
What was its main significance for the Cold War then?
It showed the superpowers were willing to engage in large-scale, bloody conflict through their allies and proxies to prevent the other side from gaining ground. It solidified the pattern of proxy wars as a key feature of the Cold War, keeping the conflict hot in places like Asia while remaining cold in Europe between the main players. It also led to a massive increase in U.S. defense spending and the militarization of NATO.
After all that intensity, Korea, the bomb, China did things cool down at all, even slightly.
There was a period of, let's say, slight relaxation, a thaw, roughly from 1953 to 1957. A major factor was the death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953.
His death changed the dynamic.
It did, somewhat. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, eventually emerged. While still a committed communist, he denounced Stalin's personality cult and extreme repression in his secret speech in 1956. He also talked about peaceful coexistence with the West, suggesting competition could be non-military. This created some hope for reduced tension.
But did the fundamental structures of the Cold War change? Did the military blocs weaken?
Not really. In fact, they solidified further during this supposed thaw. In 1955, largely in response to West Germany joining NATO that same year, the Soviet Union formalized its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact.
NATO's direct counterpart.
Exactly. A unified military organization binding the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania initially. It formalized Soviet military control over the region and created two heavily armed military alliances facing each other across the Iron Curtain. So even with talk of coexistence, the military standoff became more entrenched.
So a brief thaw, but the divisions hardened. And then things get really intense again, don't they? Leading up to perhaps the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War.
Yes, the period from about 1958 to 1962 saw tensions ratchet up dramatically again. A key factor was technology. The development and deployment of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs.
Missiles that could travel between continents in minutes.
Precisely. Both the U.S. and the USSR were developing missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads across thousands of miles, hitting each other's homeland directly. The Soviet launch of Sputnik, the first satellite, in 1957 shocked the U.S. and fueled fears of a missile gap. The threat of a sudden, devastating nuclear attack became much more immediate. Warning times shrank dramatically.
And this terrifying technological race sets the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, often called the closest the world came to nuclear war.
Without a doubt, 13 days that shook the world. Our sources state it brought the superpowers to the brink of war. It started when American U-2 spy planes discovered the Soviets were secretly installing medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missile sites in Cuba.
Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Exactly. These missiles could hit major U.S. cities like Washington, D.C. or New York within minutes, with almost no warning. It drastically altered the strategic balance and presented a direct existential threat to the U.S. homeland, something unprecedented.
How did the U.S., how did President Kennedy respond to finding nuclear missiles practically on their doorstep?
Kennedy convened an emergency group of advisors, the elcome. They debated intensely airstrikes, invasion, diplomacy. Ultimately, Kennedy chose a middle path. He announced a naval quarantine, effectively a blockade, around Cuba to prevent more Soviet ships from delivering offensive weapons.
And he went public with it.
Yes, in a televised address to the nation on October 22, 1962, he demanded the Soviets remove the missiles already there and made it clear that any missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response.
So a direct threat of nuclear war. The tension must have been unbelievable.
It was immense. For days, the world watched as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. U.S. forces went to DEFCON 2, the highest level of readiness short of actual war. There were close calls, like a Soviet submarine being forced to surface by U.S. destroyers, unaware it carried nuclear torpedoes, and its captain was authorized to use them under certain conditions. Miscalculation could have triggered catastrophe.
How was it resolved? How did they step back from the brink?
Through frantic, back-channel negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev, often bypassing formal diplomatic routes, eventually a deal was struck. Publicly, Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba under UN observation. In return, Kennedy publicly pledged that the U.S. would not invade Cuba.
Was that the whole deal?
Not quite. There was a secret component, crucial for Khrushchev to save face. The U.S. agreed to quietly remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were analogous to the Soviet missiles in Cuba, relatively obsolete, but close to the Soviet border. This secret trade-off allowed both leaders to claim a victory of sorts and de-escalate the crisis.
What were the big takeaways, the long-term impacts of staring into the nuclear abyss like that?
It had profound effects. Firstly, as our sources emphasize, the crisis showed that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union were ready to use nuclear weapons for fear of the other's retaliation, and thus of mutual atomic annihilation. MAD wasn't just theory anymore, it was proven in the crucible of crisis. Both leaders looked over the edge and pulled back.
A sobering realization for everyone.
Absolutely. It led to immediate steps to manage the danger. The hotline was established a direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin to allow leaders to talk directly in a crisis. And in 1963, they signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, banning atmospheric, underwater, and outer space nuclear tests. A small step, but the first significant arms control agreement.
But you mentioned something earlier that it also, paradoxically, hardened Soviet resolve and led to more arms buildup. How does that work?
That's a crucial, often overlooked consequence. The Soviets felt humiliated. They believed they'd been forced to back down because they were strategically inferior, especially in long-range missiles and naval power. The crisis, our sources say, hardened the Soviets' determination never again to be humiliated by their military inferiority.
So they decided to catch up, whatever the cost.
Exactly. They embarked on a massive, sustained buildup of both conventional and strategic forces, ICBMs, submarine-launched missiles, a blue water navy. They were determined to achieve nuclear parity or even superiority with the United States, and the U.S. was forced to match this buildup for the next 2.5 decades. So ironically, the crisis that showed the horror of nuclear war also fueled an even more intense and costly phase of the arms race.
So Pelby kept Europe cold, But the rivalry raged elsewhere. You mentioned Korea. Where else did the superpowers clash indirectly through these proxy wars?
Right, the core principle held. Avoided direct military confrontation in Europe. But beyond Europe, it was often a different story. Direct military interventions did happen, but as the sources note, mostly to keep allies from defecting to the other side or to overthrow them after they had done so. Essentially, enforcing spheres of influence or fighting over contested areas.
Where did the Soviets intervene militarily to maintain their blocker influence?
They used force several times within their own sphere to crush dissent or reform movements. East Germany in 1953, putting down a workers' uprising. Hungary in 1956, brutally suppressing a popular revolution seeking independence from Moscow. Czechoslovakia in 1968, leading a Warsaw Pact invasion to crush the Prague Spring reforms. And then, outside the bloc, the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 to prop up a struggling communist government against Islamic rebels, the Mujahideen.
That Afghan war turned into a disaster for them, didn't it? Their Vietnam.
Very much so. A long, bloody, costly quagmire that drained resources and morale, partly fueled by U.S. covert aid to the Mujahideen. It showed the limits of Soviet power projection.
And what about the United States? Where do they intervene, overtly or covertly, to counter communism or secure their interests?
The U.S. was also very active. They orchestrated the overthrow of a democratically elected but left-leaning government in Guatemala in 1954, fearing communist influence and protecting U.S. corporate interests, like the United Fruit Company. There was the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961, trying to oust Castro.
That was a major embarrassment for the Kennedy administration.
A huge failure. Then, the invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965 to prevent what they saw as a potential communist takeover during a civil war. Much later, the invasion of the tiny island of Grenada in 1983 to remove a Marxist government.
And of course, the biggest one, Vietnam.
Vietnam was the defining proxy war for the United States, a massive, prolonged effort from the mid-1950s until 1975 to prevent communist North Vietnam from unifying the country under its rule, defeating U.S.-backed South Vietnam. It involved hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops, immense bombing campaigns, and huge political turmoil back home.
And ultimately, the U.S. withdrew, and the North won.
Yes. Despite the enormous cost in lives American, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian, and resources, the U.S. effort failed. Vietnam was unified under communist rule in 1975. The war deeply scarred American society and led to a period of questioning America's role in the world.
What was the overall impact of all these proxy conflicts? They obviously caused immense suffering in the countries involved.
The human cost was devastating. Millions died. But beyond that, these conflicts exported the superpower rivalry across the globe. They turned local or regional disputes, post-colonial struggles, civil wars, ethnic tensions into battlegrounds for the Cold War ideologies. They fueled instability, propped up authoritarian regimes on both sides, distorted economic development, and left legacies of violence and division that, in many cases, persist even today. While Europe stayed cold, much of the so-called Third World burned hot.
Okay, so we've seen the Cold War established, the terrifying peak moments like Cuba, the proxy wars raging globally. It seemed like this bipolar standoff could last forever, but it didn't. How did this massive structure finally start to weaken and eventually collapse? It wasn't just one thing, was it?
No, definitely not. It was a complex process with multiple factors converging. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, that clear bipolar struggle began to fray. The world became, as the sources say, more complicated. It was no longer split into two clearly opposed blocs quite so rigidly.
What started to complicate the picture? What weakened that tight two-camp system?
One absolutely massive development was the Sino-Soviet split. We think of the communist world as monolithic, but it really wasn't. Starting in the late 50s and widening through the 60s, a major split developed between the two communist giants, the Soviet Union and China.
Wow, the two biggest communist powers falling out. What happened?
It was a mix of ideology, geopolitics, and personality clashes. Mao Zedong in China accused Khrushchev's Soviet Union of going soft, of betraying true revolutionary principles with peaceful coexistence and de-Stalinization. Mao saw China as the new leader of world revolution. There were also border clashes, like on the Ussuri River in 1969, and competition for influence among other communist parties and developing nations.
What was the significance of that split for the Cold War?
It was huge. It completely shattered the unity of the communist bloc. It showed communism wasn't this single global force directed from Moscow. And crucially, it gave the United States an opening. President Nixon famously visited China in 1972, beginning a process of normalizing relations. It allowed the U.S. to play the two communist powers off against each other, fundamentally changing the global balance.
So cracks appearing in the East. What about the Western Bloc? Was it still just the U.S. calling all the shots?
Not entirely. While the alliances held, the economic balance shifted. Western Europe and Japan, having rebuilt after the war, experienced incredible dynamic economic growth in the 1950s and 60s. They became major economic powers in their own right.
Reducing their dependence on the U.S.
Exactly. It reduced their relative inferiority to the United States. They had more economic clout, more independent foreign policy interests sometimes. Think of France under de Gaulle pulling out of NATO's integrated military command. The Western Bloc was still allied, but it wasn't quite as U.S.-dominated as it had been in the early years. The economic landscape became more multipolar.
And what about the smaller countries, the ones often caught in the middle? Did they gain more freedom to maneuver?
Yes, that's another key trend. As the rigid bipolarity loosened slightly, less powerful countries had more room to assert their independence. Many nations, especially in the newly decolonized world, tried to avoid taking sides, forming the non-aligned movement. They often proved resistant to superpower coercion or cajoling, learning to play the U.S. and USSR off against each other to get aid or concessions. The superpowers couldn't just dictate terms quite as easily as before.
So the world is getting more complex. And this leads into the 1970s, a period known as détente, a relaxation of tensions.
Yes, the 1970s saw a definite easing of Cold War tensions, known as détente. It wasn't the end of the Cold War, let's be clear, but it was a period of more pragmatic management of the rivalry, driven by the shared fear of nuclear war after Cuba, the economic costs of the arms race, and perhaps the complexities we just discussed.
What were the main features of détente? Arms control seems central.
Very central. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, were key. SALT First, signed in 1972, included the Anti-Ballistic Missile, ABM Treaty, limiting defensive missiles, and an interim agreement freezing the number of offensive strategic missiles. SALT II, negotiated throughout mid-70s and signed in 1979, though never ratified by the U.S. Senate due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, aimed for further limits.
So the superpowers were actually agreeing to limit their most powerful weapons.
For the first time, yes. They set limits on their anti-ballistic missiles and on their strategic missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons. It was a recognition of mutual vulnerability, an attempt to bring some stability and predictability to the nuclear arms race. There were other aspects, too, like the Helsinki Accords in 1975, which recognized European borders but also included human rights provisions and increased trade and cultural contact.
It sounds like a hopeful period, but it didn't last, did it? Tensions flared up again.
No, détente proved fragile. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, tensions surged again. Reasons were complex. The Soviets continued their massive arms buildup, especially in intermediate-range missiles targeting Europe, the SS-20s. Competition in the Third World intensified, culminating in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79, which really soured relations.
And the U.S. response.
The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 brought a much more confrontational U.S. stance. He famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire, accelerated U.S. military spending, deployed new missiles in Europe, Pershing teens and cruise missiles, to counter the SS-20s, and launched the controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars Missile Defense Research Program. The early 80s felt very much like Cold War II.
So back to confrontation. But then something changes dramatically inside the Soviet Union in the mid-80s. A new leader emerges.
Yes. This is the pivotal moment, the beginning of the end, really. In 1985, Mikhail S. Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Our sources identify him as the key figure whose actions began to break down the Cold War system, perhaps unintentionally at first.
He introduced major reforms, didn't he? Glasnost and Perestroika? What were they about?
Exactly. Gorbachev realized the Soviet system was stagnating, badly economically inefficient, technologically falling behind, politically rigid. He believed radical reform was needed to save it, not destroy it. He launched two main initiatives. Glasnost, meaning openness, aimed to reduce censorship, allow more public debate and criticism, and bring transparency to government.
Letting people actually talk about problems.
For the first time in decades, yes. It unleashed pent-up frustrations, historical grievances, and importantly, nationalist sentiments within the diverse Soviet republics. The second reform was perestroika, or restructuring. This was an attempt to revitalize the failing Soviet economy by introducing elements of market mechanisms, decentralizing control, allowing some private enterprise.
Trying to fix the economy. Did it work?
Not really. Perestroika was often inconsistent, resisted by hardliners, and disrupted the old system without effectively creating a new one. It led to shortages, inflation, and further public discontent. So, ironically, Gorbachev's attempts to reform and strengthen the Soviet system ended up dismantling the totalitarian aspects and fatally weakening its foundations. He let the genie out of the bottle.
And how did this internal loosening, this weakening of control, affect Soviet domination of Eastern Europe?
This is where the changes became truly dramatic and visible to the world. In 1989, often called the Year of Miracles, communist regimes across Eastern Europe began to crumble with breathtaking speed. Poland held semi-free elections, Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to flee west. Then the Berlin Wall came down in November '89.
And crucially, unlike before, the Soviets didn't send in the tanks.
That was the absolute game changer. Gorbachev acquiesced in their fall. He abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine, signaling that the USSR would not use force to keep communist regimes in power in Eastern Europe. This decision unleashed peaceful revolutions, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, changes in Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland. Romania was more violent, but the outcome was the same: the collapse of communist rule.
And Germany, the symbol of Cold War division.
The fall of the Berlin Wall led rapidly to German reunification in October 1990. West and East Germany became one country again, significantly within NATO. And again, Gorbachev gave his Soviet approval despite deep historical anxieties. This was a massive symbolic end to the Cold War in Europe.
So the empire crumbled externally. What was happening inside the Soviet Union itself during this tumultuous period?
Gorbachev's reforms, especially Glasnost, had, as our sources state, meanwhile weakened his own Communist Party. Its authority was eroding rapidly. Power began to shift to Russia and the other constituent republics, which were declaring sovereignty one after another, fueled by nationalism and frustration with Moscow's control. Boris Yeltsin, elected president of the Russian Republic, became a powerful rival to Gorbachev.
The center wasn't holding.
Not at all. The final act came in late 1991. After a failed coup attempt by communist hardliners against Gorbachev in August, the remaining authority of the Central Soviet government evaporated. In December 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and declared the Soviet Union dissolved.
Just dissolve.
It ceased to exist. Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time on Christmas Day 1991. In its place emerged 15 newly independent nations from its corpse, including a Russia with a democratically elected anti-communist leader, Boris Yeltsin.
And with the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself.
The Cold War was definitively over. One of the two main protagonists had simply ceased to exist in its previous form. The bipolar world order that had dominated global affairs for nearly half a century was gone.
Incredible. A truly stunning and, for many, unexpected end.
It really was. The world entered a new, uncertain era. Hashtag #outro.
Wow. What a sweep of history. From the ashes of World War II, through decades of tension, proxy wars, near misses, to the sudden dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The Cold War truly defined the second half of the 20th century.
It really did. So just to recap the journey we've taken you on, we started by defining that unique, open yet restricted rivalry, unpacking why it was cold, thanks largely to the nuclear stalemate foreseen by Orwell and cemented by Ahmad.
Right. Mutually assured destruction, the terrifying logic that kept the peace between the superpowers. We looked at the origin and the breakdown of the wartime alliance, the clashing Soviet security fears and ideology versus Western fears of domination, leading to the division of Europe with the Marshall Plan and the Iron Curtain.
Then we charted those key flashpoints and characteristics. The tense early peak with the Berlin blockade, NATO's formation, the Soviet bomb, China falling to communism, and the brutal Korean War setting the pattern for proxy conflicts.
And we spent time on that pivotal moment, the Cuban Missile Crisis, understanding how it brought the world perilously close to annihilation but also reinforced MAD, while simultaneously sparking a new, more intense arms race driven by Soviet determination never to be humiliated again.
We highlighted how the cold in Europe often meant hot and devastating wars elsewhere, as the superpowers fought indirectly across the globe, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, Guatemala to Angola, leaving lasting scars.
And finally, we explored the complex unraveling, the shifting global dynamics like the Sino-Soviet split and the rise of other powers, the brief hope of détente and arms control, the renewed tensions, and then the critical role of Gorbachev.
His reforms, glasnost and perestroika, intended to save the Soviet system, inadvertently unleashed forces nationalism, democracy movements that led to the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the reunification of Germany, and ultimately the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in 1991.
So through this deep dive, we hope you've gained that solid foundational understanding of this crucial era. That was our goal, to help you feel genuinely well-informed, cutting through the complexities to grasp the essentials of one of modern history's most defining periods.
Exactly. And now, as we wrap up, something for you to think about. The Cold War is over, but its legacies are all around us. Considering everything we've discussed, the ideological battle, the nuclear shadow, the proxy wars, the alliances like NATO that still exist, the way it shaped borders and global institutions, but what do you think is its most enduring legacy? What aspect of the Cold War continues to shape our world most profoundly today, perhaps in ways we don't always realize?
That is a really important question to ponder. What echoes still resonate? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.